As we work with ropes, we often spend most of our time working on knots and lashings and whipping of ends. What we often overlook and we neglect to our own detriment are splices. And here we have a back splice, and it's a way that we can protect the ends of a rope. And here we have an eye splice, which is a way that we can weave the rope back in on itself to produce an eyelet or a fixed loop on the end. And what we do with these loops and these weaving of this rope back in on itself, when we make these splices, what we're doing is taking the 3 strands of a rope. In this case, we're using 3/8 inch sisal. And what we'll be doing is taking these 3 strands, and on an eye splice, we would take the rope and take these loose strands and weave them back into the main fiber of our rope, leaving a loop. On a back splice, what we'll be doing is taking these, reversing their direction, and weaving them back in, and we'll be leaving a crown knot at the end to hold everything in place. And the last thing that we'll practice is doing a short splice, and a short splice is a situation where we can have a rope on this end with the strands opened up and a rope on this strands with the ends opened up, and we can actually weave them back together again and make a strong splice to join a rope and make it longer. So the first thing that we'll do is we will work on the back splice, which for me is the easiest. Each one of you, as you're working through your splices, will find one easier than the other, one more useful than the other. For me, I always work on my splices the same way. I like my back splices first, and then I'm going to wrap each one of my ends with a little bit of electrical tape so that as I'm weaving these strands back into the main core of the rope, I don't have all of my loose fibers opening up and making it more difficult. So we'll stop the video here. We'll go ahead and I'll wrap these guys, and we'll come back and we'll start on the back splice and working on that crown knot. So I'm ready to start my back splice. And when I start my back splice, I always unravel this maybe 5 or 6 times. And it never hurts to have a little extra. So I'll unravel this more than I need, and we'll discuss why when we're done at the end. But when I start making my back splice, the first thing I need to do is put my crown knot here at the end. And the crown knot depends upon the way I tie it, is I have these 3 strands opened up, and you can see I have a strand on the left and I have a strand here on the right, and my middle strand is coming from the back of my rope. Now, if I were to have the rope this way, you can see how my middle strand is coming from the top of my rope. So when I tie my back splice, I always start very systematically. Everything is always exactly the same. I have a Y with my ropes when my 3 strands are opened up. The one in the middle is always in the back. It starts off with me taking the one in the middle and just bending it up into a bite. Just going to hold them there. I've taken the one in the middle and bent it up to the top in a bite, so furthest away from me. I'm going to take the one that's now closest to me, the one on the left-hand side of that initial Y. I'm going to go around that bite and come around back. So hopefully you can see, here's my first one. I made a bite with it. I've come around it and come around the back. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one. This is the last of my Y. I'm going to come up. Oh, things are moving. I'm going to come up through that initial bite that I made with my one in the middle. Now, I had a lot of flopping around there, so we'll open it back up and we'll tie it one more time. We'll get reset. So I have my Y. Just for the sake of this, I have some things to weight things down. So why don't I weight down one of these ropes, and I'll weight down the other one with my electrical tape, if it'll make it easier to see. So all I'm using is my middle string from my Y that's coming from the back of my rope. I'm going to bend this around and make a bite. So I'm just making it a loop and laying it along the side of the rope. And I'm just going to pinch it there and hold it there. That's it. Now I'm going to take the one that's now covered up with the electrical tape. I'm going to go over that bite and come around the back of it. I'm not going to come around the back of this one, so I'm going to come between those two things. So I'm going to take this guy. I'm going to come across the top of my bite, and I'll come behind it, and I'll hold everything in place. That's a lot easier to see than the first time I tied it. What I'm going to do with this one that's behind the scissors, and I'm going to come up through this hole, kind of right up towards the camera. So I'll move the scissors out of the way. I'm going to take this end and I kind of right up through that hole. Now once this happens, I'm just going to let go. And it looks like a big, angry, ugly mess. Yours probably does too, and it's supposed to. What we're going to do now is we're going to start just pulling on each one of these individually and working this knot that we have started here down to where it cinches up to where we started uncoiling. So I'm just going to pinch this with one hand. I'm just going to leave my right hand like this. And I'm going to work this down. Just going to move one and then the other, slowly pulling them. There's no fast way to get this done. We're just taking our time. You can see as the closer we get, the more orderly this starts to look. In fact, now if I can pull on all three of these at the same time, what I've done is I've cinched all of those ropes up. I apologize when I'm getting my fingers in the way. You can see that those guys make that beautiful little triangular crown. And what happens is they start holding themselves in place. So each one is holding the next one in place. And this is the beginning of our crown knot. And one of the things I want to really point out before we get started on making this back splice that we don't see in a lot of the other videos is that this is going to look ugly. It's going to look ugly until we get about 2 strands in, and that's fine. What we're going to be doing, and maybe I'll put a little image up here, is we're going to be making a weave that's very, very similar to the finger trap puzzles that we've seen when we were kids, where the harder we pull across, the tighter it latches down on itself. And that's what we're forming when we make the back splice. That's why this braid looks kind of familiar, because we've seen it in those finger trap puzzles before. So with the way that this works for us is we want to take each one of these strands and go over one, under one, over one, under one. So if I take a look at, let's pretend we don't see those. Let's take a look at this one strand here. What I want to do is go over one and under one. So I'm going to open up my rope. If I take this and move this to the side, the technique that I'm going to do is I'm going to take my rope and I'm going to take my right hand, roll it away from me so that the rope fibers open up a bit. If I release my hand, they close back up. This is the beauty of the rope. If we roll away, they'll open up, and that's going to let us access that weave. So I'm going to take any of these guys. We'll start off with this one. It's right here. I'm going to go over this strand and then under this strand. And this is where the electrical tape comes in. So I'm going to go over the first one, under the second one. Open it up. I'm going to go over and then under. And I'll pull through. Just going to leave them there for a second. Let's roll up to this next rope. Now if we take a look at this guy, I want to go over this one and then under this one. You can see that's the next rope in the sequence. So over and under. So over, open it up a little bit, and under, and we'll pull it. Let's go to the next rope. Same sequence. We want to go over this one. Now we've got a lot of ropes going on here, and like I said, it's going to start looking ugly, and that's okay. We don't care where these guys are. We want to pay attention to the ropes that are working here, these strands. We want to go over and under these strands. So if I open this up, I can see this is one of them. I'm going to go over that guy. And the next strand that I have Pull these all snug. Over this strand, that's the first one. Now the next strand in this rope is that guy. So you can see, I'm gonna go over that guy and under this guy. Over and under. And I promised you it was going to be real ugly at the beginning. We got one more of these and we're through the ugly part. First thing we're going to do is we're going to pull this all nice and snug. We don't want a whole lot of bagginess going on here. I'm just going around and tugging on anything that I can get my hands on that seems loose. Once I tighten it up, we're doing okay here. So let's take a look at any of these strands. It doesn't matter which one we start with. Let's start with this one. It's right there. So we want to go over and under. We'll do that. Open it up. Over and under. You can see where this electrical tape is coming in handy. Pull it through. Let's go to our next rope, our next strand. And you can see how things are looking a little easier to understand now. Over and under. Come to our last rope. We know it's the last one because these guys are going in this direction. He's shooting off way off the side. So we know this. We haven't done that one yet. Let's take a look at our rope. Before we do anything, let's tighten it down. So what should we do with this guy? We've got a lot of images going on there, a lot of rope. So we need to figure out which ones do we need to pay attention to. We don't need to care about these guys that we're weaving in. Let's get those off to the side. We need to go over this rope. But now which one of these do we go under? And the one we go under is the one that's coming from this rope. So we take a look and we can open this up. We're going to go over this strand. You can see that's this strand. Goes underneath, comes out there. Then we need to go under this one. That's the next one in this strand. Let's go over that and under. Once we get about 2 weaves or 2 turns, 2 passes, whatever you want to phrase it, past that crown knot, this is going to start looking correct. It's going to look wrong every time you start it. And that's just the way it looks. It's okay. But now we can start taking a quick look at this guy. Things look orderly now, so we're going to take this rope. We're going to go over one, under one. Let's go over one and under one. Pull tight. Next rope, we're going to go over one and under one. So we'll go over one, under one. If you're watching this video 3 or 4 times in order to get this splice correct, you're going to get real tired of hearing me say this, but you got to do it. Say it out loud, say it in your head. It's going to help. Just like we did the square knot, we did left over right, right over left for our splices. Just get in the habit of saying over one, under one, over one, under one. Here's our last rope. We know it's our last rope because these guys are coming out at the same distance. He's lagging behind, so we haven't done him yet. So for this one, we need to go over one, under one, and we're going to go under this one because that's the one that's part of this rope. That's the next guy in our sequence. Pull snug as we work. Tighten it up. that is our back splice. You can see when we were down here, it really looked ugly because we were changing the transition on all of our ropes. And it just causes a bit of a traffic jam. We take our time, we work through it, and we can get that braiding pattern down. Now this is why I always go probably one wrap longer than I need to when I'm loosening my rope, is that by the time we get here towards the end, it's such a pain in the neck to try to filter these guys through that I probably wouldn't even be able to do it if I didn't have the electrical tape on there. But rather than trying to take this last inch or half inch or so and braid these last little bits through, I always pull a little extra. That way when I get to the end, I can just cut them off. I'm gonna go ahead and cut those little sections off. One, I'll probably find that later. Two, that went somewhere. Three. And what we get is a nice smooth finish to our back splice because we've taken the rope and spliced it back in on itself. And this weaving pattern is the exact same pattern that we use when we do our eye splice. It's exactly the same. So once we get through the transition, for the back splice, the hardest part is the anchor knot transition. We're working back. We just take our time. For the eye splice, the hardest part is the transition of going back in on itself. And then for the short splice, the hardest transition is to figure out if I have these three ends here and these three ends here, which rope am I looking at? And each one just takes our time. So finished up the back splice. This is where we started. This is what we finished. Next one we'll do is the eye.